All right, welcome everyone. Today we're stepping into something a little different. We're diving into a truly grim, dark, gothic fable. In this explainer, we'll be taking a journey through the haunting, philosophical corridors of a text known as The Architecture of Spiritual Suicide. It's a completely fascinating exploration of what actually happens when the human desire for total control crosses the line into complete self-destruction.
And we're just going to plunge directly into the chilling consequence of absolute power. It leads us to a pretty horrifying reality, which is described simply as a motionless heap in an empty room. This right here is the dark reality of a forced vacuum. You see, when a creator seeks to dominate their environment so completely that literally nothing pushes back, well, they aren't left with a kingdom. They're left with a terrifying, meaningless silence.
Act 1. The Illusion of Sovereignty. So our first creator in this fable is the architect. He's a builder who sought to erase all physical and conceptual limits to construct this endless palace. He was absolutely obsessed with total sovereignty. He went through and methodically removed every single boundary stone and cut down every sacred pole in his domain. He genuinely believed that by destroying every limit, by completely erasing every trace of the not I, his own personal will would just expand and become the absolute I of the entire world.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this ambition requires us to understand a crucial concept, the not I. In philosophical terms, the not I is basically the external world. It's the boundaries, the walls, and the essential friction that's necessary for the self to actually measure its own existence. The architect completely failed to realize that without this friction, he couldn't even feel his own limbs. I mean, you need something to push against to know you're even moving, right?
And that brings us to the horrifying twist of our first parable. By destroying all external friction, the architect didn't become a god. No, he became a prisoner of a motionless void. He ended up ruling over a meaningless silence. The text refers to this ultimate loss of context and meaning as spiritual suicide.
Act 2. The Castration of Reality.
Moving deeper into this cursed palace, we find the gardener. Originally, his reality was one of chaotic, diverse, and fragmented blooming wildflowers. But the gardener? He was totally repulsed by this chaos. In a profoundly cowardly decision, he chose to replace that vibrant, living bloom with smooth, painted stones. He wanted a perfect, seamless order where things would just never change.
In Nietzschean terms, what the gardener was terrified of was the Dionysian reality. This is the chaotic, vibrant, and totally unpredictable force of raw life. By paving over it with those painted stones, the gardener literally castrated the Dionysian reality of life. Because of his obsessive need for control, the bees vanished, and the incredibly rich soil beneath his painted stones simply died.
So what he was left with is defined here as an Apollonian illusion. The garden didn't become this masterpiece of eternal beauty. It became a silent graveyard. It was a sterile, rigid illusion and an unchanging, lightless mask. And the text makes a really crucial point here. This illusion wasn't born from strength, not at all. It was born from a weak will that was entirely unable to endure the heavy, unpredictable weight of existence. This whole theme of weakness disguised as order brings us to our third creator, the Weaver. He was utterly terrified by the shifting perspectives and multiplicity of existence. Looking at 1,000 different stories and threads was simply way too much for him to handle. So he panicked. First, he literally burned the loom of multiplicity, just destroyed it. Then he rebranded the entire vibrant tapestry of the past as chaos and heresy. Finally, he sat down to weave a singular, unadorned narrative. But this single thread wasn't the truth. It was a tapestry that reflected only his own face. Now, to justify this massive destruction of history, he employed what philosophy calls the mechanism of slave morality. He looked at the diverse threads of his neighbors and demonized them, calling them monstrous abominations. By framing their vibrant existence as evil, he was able to convince himself that his own sterile, empty vacuum was somehow good. But of course, the Weaver's grand narrative was a total lie. It was nothing more than a historical fabrication born out of pure fear. It was essentially a shroud designed to hide the fact that he was entirely alone, a prisoner of his own reflection. Act 3. The Revaluation. We now arrive at the climax of our fable, and we're adopting the passionate, highly critical voice of the text's central critic, the royal philosopher of the void.
He kicks things off with this intense diatribe. You speak of sovereignty as if it were a banquet, but you are merely eating the air of a forced vacuum. The philosopher totally exposes the creator's so-called divine monopoly. They look at their work and see a grand temple, but the philosopher reveals it for what it truly is, a staggering monument to exhaustion.
The philosopher directly accuses these men of performing a systematic cultural castration. They shattered the boundary stones, they cut down the sacred poles, and they completely retreated from the friction of truth. And why? Well, not because they were strong conquerors, but because their wills were far too weak to face a master who actually welcomes the struggle of existence.
And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic architecture we've been unpacking. The architect sought the absolute I, but his reality was an empty room. The gardener wanted perfect order, but created a silent graveyard of dead soil. The weaver wanted a singular narrative, but only produced a historical fabrication. Each creator's quest for an illusion led directly to a horrifying, sterile reality.
Which brings us to the philosopher's ultimate, devastating realization. These men did not assimilate the not I. They didn't conquer the world at all. They merely retreated into an empty room. They mistook the hollow silence of being alone for absolute power, dancing on the strings of their own deep insecurity to become nothing more than puppet kings in a silent, lightless cage.
So this leaves us with a pretty dark, provocative thought. We all seek control in our lives, right? We all want to smooth out the chaotic, Dionysian realities we face every day. But we have to ask ourselves, in our pursuit of perfect order, are we actually mastering our reality, or are we just cutting away the friction of truth and building our very own silent, lightless cage? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating fable with me.